Speaking of civil society organisations working with digital tech for the good, it's my very great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker for the ADMS Symposium, Tarunima Prabhakar. Did I nail it? Who is the research lead and co-founder of an organisation called Tattle, which focuses on the unique challenges of addressing inaccurate and harmful information in India and the global south. Her broader research interests are in the intersection of technology, policy, and global development. And as a practitioner, she's worked on ICTD and data-driven development projects with not-for-profits and tech companies in Asia and the United States. Please make her very warmly welcome.
Thank you. I'm just give me 1 second so I can be on time. Okay. Hello, everyone. So thank you. It is an honor to be invited to this event. And as accidental as it may be, I am now opening, so that's a double honor. So thank you for that. I should be nervous, but I've had such a fantastic time interacting with everyone over the last few days. And so I feel quite at ease and I feel very welcome. So thank you for that as well. So as you'll hear in my talk, the Indian experience of colonialism has a lot to do with how we look at platform governance and the debates around it today. So when I was coming here, I was I was thinking this might be something unique that I will have to say to everyone. Maybe to some of you here, it might be new. But then I realized, I got here and I realized how naive I was, because colonialism has been pervasive and every place has its own experiences of it and its own histories of erasures. So this is, for me, I now recognize, as I've heard all of you say over the last few days, that yes, this is land of the Gadigal people, and it wasn't ever ceded. And so this is a lesson, so I'm a guest on their lands as well, and this is a lesson for me to carry home and learn more about. Okay, so with that, I'm going to jump into what I have to say. As mentioned in the introduction, I'm the research lead and co-founder at Tattle Civic Tech. We are, I'm going to get into what a civic tech organization is. We build tools and data sets to respond to inaccurate and harmful content in the country. If researchers in the room are surprised why I am here, I was surprised too when we received the invitation. Tattle started as a small side research project in 2018, because not too long back we had parents who were chiding their children for staring at screens, and fast forward to 2018, you have parents staring at screens all the time. And in India, it was predominantly using one app, which was WhatsApp. The number of WhatsApp users in India has dovetailed, and it continues to dovetail the number of internet users in the country. And we have these WhatsApp groups. This might be familiar to some of you here as well, where you have alumni groups, family groups, friends, and most of these are raging, and I think it's reduced over time, but they would be raging with opinions and fierce debates. And we would have tried, I have tried, on an ad hoc basis to intervene in some of these conversations. But I think at some point you just start giving up. It's too much content, it flows very fast. And it wasn't clear to me how one would even go about intervening, because with a platform like WhatsApp, there is no algorithmic amplification of content by the platform. So it's not quite clear how culpable they are, regardless of how governments want to push that narrative. That is my position. WhatsApp is the most popular platform in the global south, and in my view, it still is less understood than Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. Twitter has been heavily researched due to its API, and Facebook has faced a fair bit of scrutiny in the post-Brexit Trump moment. Now, when you come to closed messaging apps, it isn't quite clear how you actually go about understanding information flows on it. So we said, let's start by just archiving what we were seeing on our small WhatsApp groups. It could provide for some examples, right? It could tell us, for example, how much of this content was getting caught by the fact-checking community in India, or just how much of the content on my sort of small little WhatsApp universe was getting caught by the fact-checking community. It could also sort of help us understand if some of this content from WhatsApp was making its way to Facebook, or how much of the content from these big social media platforms was afterwards making it to WhatsApp. Like I said, this was a side project. Both me and my co-founder had full-time jobs. We made it an open source project because we thought, well, it would allow like-minded individuals to join. We also expected it to, sort of not succeed. I mean, we thought, we didn't think that we would always have this team to run it. And so we said that, well, at some point, if we get tired, someone else should be able to take it over. Let's just keep everything open. My full-time job at the time was to study how predictive analytics and machine learning were being used to, or were just being deployed towards the development agendas of the country. And so at the time I was looking at financial inclusion. In 2018, there was a spate of lynchings triggered by WhatsApp or by messages on WhatsApp, and that brought attention to the platform. I think this happened globally. And relatedly, it brought attention to this tiny side project. We got a grant and we said, okay, let's devote some time turning these scrappy research tools that we had written for ourselves into more stable, reliable systems that other researchers and journalists could use as well. So one tool led to another, and in a desire to link the archived content with fact-checked content, we landed up creating a database of fact-checked content, or basically articles of fact-checking groups that were writing these reports. That community has grown a lot over the last 3 years. As a standalone resource, this the dataset itself was helpful for other researchers and journalists. And then as we started looking and the volume of data was increasing, we realized we have to be able to search and analyze a lot of this. And in India, as is true of a lot of countries in the global south, the way people communicate on social media is not primarily through text. It's in multiple languages. People will use images, videos, they leave audio notes. And so really what the sort of the crux of the data set that we're looking at is multilingual and multimodal data. And so then we had to sort of think through, how you process it. So we developed a couple of machine learning APIs. And then we tried to link the machine learning APIs with the data sets. And we called it Kosh, which is really like just the Hindi word for a collection or an archive. We don't know how to show machine learning, and we don't know how to show archives. So that's why we get illustrators to sort of, make it look, I think, accessible. I think people kind of have to have like have to have some intuitive sense of what these systems can help them do. So anyway, that's why we usually do some sort of cute illustrations with most of our work. I think they're cute. Okay, and then, it's not as if you're able to predict how all of these systems will get used, but then when COVID-19 struck India, we were able to sort of use these scrapers to understand how relief work was being coordinated on WhatsApp during the second wave of the pandemic. So just for some background, during the second wave of the pandemic, what happened in India was that there were just a lot more cases, and the public infrastructure when it came to healthcare was collapsing. And so people were actually texting each other on WhatsApp saying, like, do you have oxygen cylinders? Do you have masks? But what was also happening on these groups at the time was that when, for example, as if a woman was asking for help for her family, those numbers were also then sort of being used to harass them and call them. So there were a lot of like unintended consequences of actually coordinating relief on WhatsApp, which people had not foreseen, right? So we basically said that this was information chaos and what happens in such an extreme situation. So 4 years from when we started, which is about now, we have multiple projects and project streams that are supporting research or action on new media platforms. 6 years ago, if you had asked me what I wanted to do with my time, I would not have said that I want to build an organization. That is not, how we started. It really did start as a research project. And so now I have to work with mentors, not have to, I mean, very willingly, I need the advice, who have scaled products and organizations to try and understand how we should run our own. They will ask me how writing research papers aligns with OKRs and mission vision bets, frameworks that are a part of the daily parlance in nonprofits and corporates. I don't know if there are folks from that world here. And then between being a product manager, an engineer, a fundraiser, it's sometimes hard to justify writing papers, especially because we're not an academic institution. I still do it, but it is hard to justify. And so I wondered what I had to say to researchers who have perhaps a one-arm distance. I've learned that many of you don't, but I also think from the conversations that many of us do. And so I was wondering, what do I have to say to people who have a one-arm distance from the day-to-day grunt of building automated products, a distance that I sometimes now look at wistfully. Because I think it's often just fun or not fun, it's intriguing to actually have the distance and look at these teams and understand their processes. So I think there's a lot of value to that distance. But I had to recognize that despite that longing, and despite the frustrations of running or building an organization, I had stuck with it because I not only found the work worthwhile and important, but also that I think it's deeply intellectually satisfying. At every step of the way, we have to decide on questions with non-obvious answers. And these are, each of these questions sort of open a Pandora's box where researchers will devote a lot of time. But then for all of these questions, we actually have to make decisions as well. So I'd stumbled into an awkward position of being a researcher outside of academia and an engineer or product developer outside of a profit-driven tech company. And in building tech, in response to the degeneracy of big tech platforms and big governments, I think we risk being tainted by some of it. And yet, I think it is worth it. So that is what I am going to talk about. It is our experience of building civic tech. But through that experience, I think what I'm also trying to say to this audience is that by delving into the trenches at the risk of muddying ourselves is a worthwhile endeavor. It is a worthwhile endeavor, especially for researchers who are concerned with the direction that our digital society is taking. Okay, actually, yeah. So in our first call, Jean asked me, what is a civic tech organization anyway? And I said, great question, which is what you do when you hear a question that you should have a good answer to, but you don't. So when we named the organization, Tattle, my co-founder Denny and I, we had a lot of discussions. We ran polls. It was a sort of long process. But then we added civic tech at the end, and there was no discussion about it, because somewhere implicitly, I think we both, after having done this work for about a year, were like, yes, we are a civic tech organization. Now, one could argue that it was our folie à deux, our collective delusion, because civic tech as a concept is rather nebulous. So this is a screenshot from a 2013 report by the Knight Foundation, and it divided civic tech initiatives into these two broad clusters of open government and community action. The biggest cluster in their sort of categorization was peer-to-peer local sharing, which they classified as community action. Now, peer-to-peer local sharing included services like Craigslist, the short-term rental platform Airbnb, and ride-sharing platforms like Lyft. I think this report is reflective of the heady optimism around the internet in the early 2010s. A 2019 report, I think, yeah, there we go. Okay, a 2019 report by Omidyar Network in India also uses this categorization of open government initiatives and civic engagement. But here, civic engagement is used to primarily imply citizens interacting with laws, government benefits, and community development agendas. The way I read this report is that there is an underlying presumption that there is an ideal relationship between the citizen and the state, and that relationship is predetermined and static. The role of civic tech is to actually move us closer to those goals. Now, we can't place Tattle in this framework because we started with the assumption that how citizens relate to each other and how citizens relate to the state is neither static and nor is it self-evident. New media technologies in particular are shifting how evidence is generated, and they're shifting how evidence is communicated. In the process, they're opening spaces for renegotiation of who gets to be an expert, and it's also altering how citizens view their relationship to each other as well as to the state. For us, civic technology is actually tech that claims greater space for citizens in this renegotiation. Okay, so that's a lot of verbiage, and I'll make it more concrete through the history of platform politics, the sort of world around us that we were responding to. In India, as in many other countries, social media platforms have been linked to the rise of polarization and extremist politics. The 2014 election, which propped the current government first into power, it was dubbed as India's first social media election. Less than 6 months into Mr. Modi's tenure as Prime Minister, Mr. Zuckerberg came to India to meet him. And he expressed support for Mr. Modi's vision of a digital India. It was in line with his own vision of connectivity as a human right that he had expressed in a white paper published during the launch of internet.org in the previous year. In 2015, which is a few months after Mr. Zuckerberg had visited India, internet.org launched Free Basics, an app that provided a few websites. So it included Facebook and Facebook Messenger. It also included news websites such as the BBC and some entertainment websites, and it was free of cost. So they partnered with Reliance, which is one of the biggest business houses in India, to roll out that service. But Indian entrepreneurs and civil society argued that this walled garden gave privileged access to an American behemoth at the cost of local businesses. It was a violation of net neutrality. That is a concept that most of us might be familiar with. And that's a principle that Facebook had backed in the US. So on the surface of it, what the signals that went out were that Facebook is partnering with an elite Indian business, pretending to do good while masking its own business interest, and working with different norms in the beneficiary country than those that it applied in its own. It was hard to not see this as a manifestation of neocolonialism. In 2016, the Indian regulator banned Free Basics. Mr. Andreessen, Mark Andreessen, who's an early investor in Facebook, confusingly quipped that anti-colonialism had been catastrophic for India for decades. Why stop now? So this sort of narrative of colonialism playing out in platform governance has actually been a sort of underlying fault line in how I think platform governance is viewed in India, but it's also something that actually made its way to Silicon Valley. I think, yeah, this incident does a very good job of describing the platform governance ping pong that follows. And I think this is not just it's not just the fault lines in India. These are also the fault lines, I think, through which platform governance is viewed in a lot of other countries. In 2018, the government proposed a national digital communications policy that in a section on digital sovereignty specifically addressed net neutrality and encryption. In subsequent proposals, it pushed for data localization, which is the principle that all data about Indian citizens be sort of placed in India. And there's been a lot of back and forth on whether we're talking about personal data, non-personal data, all sort of economic data, but I think broadly there's been this push for the principle of localizing data about Indian citizens. In 2021, the Indian government amended the IT Act, which is the sort of reigning act through which a lot of tech policy currently is viewed. I think that's going to soon change. And that act mandated that social media platforms with users higher than a defined threshold would need to enable the identification of the first originator of the content. It also mandated that companies would have to appoint a grievance and a compliance officer who would face criminal actions for any violations that the platform made against the Indian law. So ostensibly, this law is well-intentioned, right? It is responding to, for example, a concern that was raised in the parliament in the previous year about children accessing pornographic content. And that report had also similarly said that law enforcement agencies need to be able to access what's happening on WhatsApp, because that's where a lot of, they didn't specifically call out WhatsApp, but closed messaging apps, because that's where a lot of Indian sort of young children and teenagers were. But then WhatsApp sued the Indian government, saying that these new internet laws undermine the privacy of users and they enable mass surveillance. Now, given that law enforcement in India has been found to selectively target academics and activists, one could possibly argue that WhatsApp is also well-intentioned. Another data point is that the Indian government has, the orders to take down content from Twitter have steadily increased from 2014 to 2022. The Indian government's position is Twitter is not, it's an American platform, but it has to listen or obey the laws around speech and harm in India. In 2022, Twitter took the Indian government to court over provisions to remove content and block accounts because it claimed that these were selectively targeting specific groups that were dissenting of the government. Now, in all these cases, the side you pick has more to do with how much you trust the government or the private sector in the moment. And there are good reasons to trust neither. Many of us here would agree that global platforms replicate structures of colonial enterprises. But then when nationalistic governments use the same rhetoric, they steer the direction of digitalization and automation in rather worrying directions. Now, I grew up in the heyday of the internet. Internet felt like the best thing on earth. It was the place where you had small people talk to each other, building things with each other. There were the big people, but for the most part, they weren't really affecting things for us. We were still, doing our own thing. And of course, that vision was naive. It was naive. But I think this current picture, where for all our problems on the internet, our best bet is to go plead platforms or governments, both of which have good incentives not to act in our interest, feels like swinging to the other end. It feels like a rather disempowering position. The designers of platforms understand that we are dealing with socio-technical systems, and in our critiques, we call them out as such. So from our perspective, civic engagement should also be socio-technical. For us, civic tech isn't about reducing the burden of action from platforms and governments. It's precisely doing the opposite. It is citizens using technology to understand these powerful entities better and then holding them to account. It is also a deeply reflexive exercise because by building these socio-technical systems, one is committing to enter the playing field whose rules we are trying to alter. We are entering the playing field not as a player determined to score a goal, but almost like a sensor, like a buoy on the ocean, that is describing how changing the rules or proposals for changing the rules on the outside is going to change things on the inside. Let me explain what I mean by this through a case study. Please be forewarned, it's a lengthy case study. Okay, at some point in 2020, we had about 1.6 terabytes worth of data. These were images and videos from platforms that were acting or branding themselves as content creation apps for messaging apps, right, like WhatsApp. So they would have filters, and you could sort of create these memes, and then they would have a button saying share on WhatsApp, so you could actually push this content on WhatsApp. So we were figuring out how should we open this data responsibly. We couldn't possibly manually comb through 1.6 terabytes of data. And it mirrored the content that was circulated on social media and chat apps, right? So it was selfies, funny memes, conspiracy theories, hateful content, and these are not exclusive categories. So you have conspiracy theories that interact with hateful content in creative pieces of speculative fiction, and then you have memes that cleverly use humor to build narratives. And so in deciding what we should or should not release, we were encountering the same content moderation questions that a social media platform faces. We started looking at off-the-shelf open source solutions to help us flag abusive posts in our data. And we knew from the get-go that content moderation systems were disproportionately focused on English. But then when we were trying to create this mild content moderation layer on our data, we realized just how dire the situation was. Big tech platforms have been called out for not devoting adequate attention to non-English speaking populations, but it isn't just big tech that needs some layer of content moderation. Every email service provider, workplace forum, I assume even this university's sort of internal forums, would need some way of flagging abusive or spammy content. And typically, these systems have relied on open lists that have been created in the past by researchers or just released by industry as sort of public goods. But a basic list of slur or abusive words were not available in most Indian languages. And at some point, ironically, a CEO of an Indian social media company backed by a VC complained about this on LinkedIn, and they said, why aren't there off-the-shelf tools that can enable us to build a responsible social media platform that can compete with global ones? The irony is that this really should be the job of social media platforms to begin with. So we set ourselves to building another tool, one that would detect abusive content in Indian languages. But since we are a small team, we said we can't look at all Indian languages. There are 22 that are constitutionally recognized. And so we sort of narrowed the problem and we said, okay, let's start by looking at gendered abuse in 3 Indian languages. The reason why we picked gendered abuse to begin with is that I think there is a long history of physical abuse in India, but we're seeing some of the worst manifestations of it coming online. People of marginalized genders are disproportionately targeted. It's higher than most other countries. And also that it's intersecting with religion, caste, politics, right? And so we see a lot of people of marginalized genders just sort of recede from these online spaces. So we said, let's actually start by looking at that problem in 3 Indian languages. And suddenly, critiques of how machine learning systems and guidelines on machine learning systems and how these should be built stopped being theoretical. So this was our opportunity to build a better bottom-up machine learning model. And the group here is perhaps well aware that the world of machine learning, which I think is frustratingly called AI, is replete with guidelines, right? And there are, I don't know, like at some point there were 300 plus, and they describe broad principles of transparency, explainability, autonomy, fairness. And then there's been critique of these principles where many feminist scholars from the global south have been right to point out that the language of principles and ethics does not account for historical patterns of injustice. That content moderation systems are primarily built for English is just one manifestation of that inequity. So this group of scholars have also proposed their own manifestos. And they are basically pushing practitioners to account for the broader context in which machine learning systems are developed. Of course, there are differences in them. But broadly speaking, these were the principles that we found common to all of them. So there's the first principle of intersectionality. It is a recognition that not all inequality is alike. So we should account for the ways in which people's social identities overlap to create a unique experience of oppression. That these models be community-based and participatory. That everyone who has contributed to that system, right from the data collection to the labeling, to the engineering, all of them are adequately recognized. That there's a diversity of viewpoints, and this also includes diversity in what feminism can mean. And that the work is localized and situated and it accounts for the context in which these systems are going to be deployed. So armed with these guidelines, we set about building our own machine learning driven moderation tool. But what we realized very quickly is that at every step of the way of building the system, these guidelines had to be interpreted. And at every stage, there were multiple interpretations possible. So at a higher process level, this is how we interpreted these principles. Our core team comprised of feminist scholars who spoke the 3 languages we were working with. Ambika Tandon, who was one of the authors of one of the feminist principles I shared earlier on the slide, and I shared the project management responsibilities. We decided that what constitutes abuse should be determined by those at the receiving end of it. It shouldn't be determined by an average social media user. For 6 months, we conducted interviews and focus group discussions with gender rights activists and scholars in South Asia to try and understand what is their experience of abuse online. We tried to ensure diversity within this group so that there was representation across different sexualities, caste, religion, and geographies. We documented the needs we heard, and these went beyond just frustrations with platform inaction on the content. And we decided to work on some of these needs. So it wasn't just about detection or filtering of abuse. We also looked at archiving, invoking networks for action. I will not get into the sort of challenges of building the other features. I will continue to focus on the detection or building systems for detection of abuse. And then you get to the nuts and bolts, right? Like the actual sort of the team dynamics and working to build this automated system. And that is where I think these interpretations get very messy. So the first step is to come up with a definition of abusive content based on everything we have heard from these interviews and participants. Not surprisingly, there is significant heterogeneity in what constitutes abuse, even within this community, because there are sort of fierce differences even within the gender rights community in India, and I think broadly as well. Algorithmic making systems, LLMs or not, cannot handle the complexity of factors that contribute to an experience of abuse. For example, a recurring good morning message day after day from a stranger is supposed to serve as a reminder to some activists that they are being watched. But from the perspective of a classifier, it is just an innocuous morning wish. For 4 months, the core team wrote and rewrote a definition of abuse that could capture as much of the diversity of experience with the least number of labels. Ultimately, this data had to be annotated by activists who are fighting battles at multiple fronts, and we wanted to minimize the time that they spend with this rather exhausting content. So we came up with a rather unconventional annotation guideline, and we asked them 3 questions. We said, is this post gendered abuse when it is directed at a person of marginalized gender? Is this post gendered abuse when it's not directed at a person of marginalized genders? And does this post contain explicit or aggressive language? For those of you who might be well-versed with the sort of machine learning data annotation process, I think this guideline will appear a little absurd. But I look at these first 2 questions as a reflection of the principles we were trying to live up to. Because women of minority religions and oppressed castes in India would get more abuse than other women. For many, but not all, the people we interviewed, explicit language directed at marginalized genders is gendered abuse. And so we didn't have a great way to resolve this disagreement in definitions. And we said, let's just leave both the questions in and see how people annotate the data. That's something we'll have to learn from. So the next step was collecting annotations in 3 different languages. And once we moved beyond the messy job of defining what abuse is, we had to translate these guidelines into 3 languages. As with translation of books, every guideline in every language stands on its own, because the local language speaker has to adapt it to include examples from their social media experience that best reflects the spirit of these original definitions. I have no doubt that had the guidelines been translated by a different person, they would have looked different. For each language, we had roughly 2,300 posts annotated by 3 or more people. There were another 6,400 that were annotated by 1 person. But when we look at these 2,300 posts, we actually see quite a bit of disagreement in our cohort of annotators. This is something, it's, the Krippendorf alpha is just a score you use. Sorry for the math, but yeah, it's a score you use to sort of estimate disagreement. And for a lot of the facial recognition or like the image recognition tasks, the scores go over like a 0.6, 0.7, or at least aspirationally. But I think what I want to actually highlight here is that there is a there is a variation in agreement across languages, right? So for example, the Tamil-speaking activists and researchers were more aligned on whether a post contained explicit or aggressive language than the English or Hindi-speaking activists. There could be a number of reasons for this, right? It could be a function of the guideline itself. It could be a difference in the background of the annotators. It could be a function of the data in each language. I mean, we can retrospectively try and do a lot of analysis, but this is just a very, I think, messy process. So when you're looking at all this disagreement, you have to still design a machine learning model and figure out how to handle this disagreement. And this is when you start hitting sort of classical political philosophy questions, right? Should we take a majority vote on the label? So if 2 of the 3 people have said this is gendered abuse, it is. But if we don't do that, don't we flatten out the minority voice? What if that one dissenting label represents knowledge of a regional variation of a word or a slur that the other activists don't know of? By the end of the year of the project, I think every team member involved was just exhausted trying to understand the disciplinary language of others in the group and trying to explain where they were coming from. I think there were about 8 months of endless negotiations for our own point of view on how something should be built, and then engineers saying how something can or cannot be built. I think what kept us going was the need to respond to gendered abuse in India and a commitment to disciplinary equality. I think that is quite critical. Like, a commitment to disciplinary equality is very important. We were also all genuinely curious what machine learning done differently could look like. And there are numerous papers that have and will come out of the battle scars of this work, but this work was not intended as an academic exercise. Our goal was to build something that ameliorated the effects of gendered abuse in Indian languages. So all these negotiations had to be settled at least for a certain time, and decisions had to be made. So we deployed the machine learning model along with some other features in a plugin that we called Uli. It's a Tamil word for chisel. And this plugin allows users to moderate abuse on their Twitter feeds. We allowed for certain customizations so that users could choose to redact words that weren't in the default list of words that we had crowdsourced. But yeah, and there were additional features for archiving, as I had mentioned earlier. But I want to now just do some stock taking about how this process held up against the principles that I mentioned earlier. So we said intersectionality, right? Our core team and annotation group reflected the diversity of backgrounds beyond gender. We included questions that allowed us to capture non-misogynistic content. And so that could be casteist and racialized language. So people could say that, okay, like this is not misogynistic, but it's still sort of abusive. We did have a community-based participatory approach because what constitutes abuse came from the community that was actually going to use this plugin. All the annotators are mentioned on the website. We're going to include them on the technical papers. It was developed by a team from India for Indians, so possibly localized. And then we created some features for customization so people can alter it. But also, the code is open source, so theoretically anyone can tweak the model and adapt it for their own context. But for all of these principles, I can also describe various ways in which our project does not align with it. I think you might have guessed it with some of the condescension about the successes while I was just speaking about it. So for one, our project did privilege gender over other identity types, and people could not flag. There was no option for people to say that, this is also racialized or this is also content. They had an option to say this is not gendered but abusive. While the disparity in compensation between engineers, researchers, and annotators was lesser than some of the other machine learning products we know of, we did, to a large extent, punt thorny questions of data ownership. We didn't design for the data collection systems, or we didn't design them in a way that the data that was collected and annotated would be accessible to the people who annotated from the get-go. This is something we are addressing this year, but it was a limitation for the first year. We also relied on other large language models, such as BERT, where the labor behind annotations has not been adequately recognized. As for localized development, India is a rather big country. So from the scale of a village or even a city, I don't know how to say whether Uli was localized. But I also think localized development is a goal that I have a lot of difficulty interpreting. I think it behooves us to embrace the multiplicity of scales of communities that the internet has enabled. At any given time, we are a part of our university groups, our neighborhood groups. We're part of possibly sort of national level political groups, but we're also part of transnational communities. And I think the internet has enabled us to connect with people who are not geographically co-located, right? And for many of these people, these transnational solidarities have been their source of courage and comfort. I don't know if the more responsible thing for us would have been to not look at gender abuse in 3 languages, but rather just focus on, say, the LGBTQ community in North India. Pluralism is another principle, I think, against which Uli struggles. We allowed for customizations, but as any behavioral economist or HCI researcher will tell you, defaults matter. In theory, anyone can fork Uli since it's open source, but that is in theory. I foresee maybe some engineers and technical researchers forking this project as curiosity, but realistically, I don't foresee any of the activists and researchers that we were working with doing the same in the short run. And this whole process has made me wonder whether pluralism can actually live alongside the reductive mechanics of machine learning. There were ideas, for example, to live with this value, right, which was that we can create multiple machine learning models where different sort of communities provide their data, and each of these reflects different values. And then a user of Uli can choose which machine learning model and which sort of moderation logic they want to use on their feed. But this is just, I think from an engineering perspective, not quite feasible. First of all, there is a cost, there's an economic cost, but there's also a human cost to annotating this data. We had activists who actually stopped annotating the data in between because they were just, given the political climate, they said, we are too tired and we cannot deal with this abusive content right now. But also that the cost of maintaining these multiple models is quite high. So from one perspective, I think the principles of pluralism and sort of in-context situated work allow for precisely the kind of flexibility that I have described, right? Where we can claim that, okay, like this is, in some version of our world, this is a feminist AI project. But I feel like a lot of projects could similarly assess themselves as meeting these criteria in one way or the other. I think back to this Knight Foundation report from 2013, and then not too far back, we were looking at ride-sharing services as community engagement. And I think it is hard for some of us to accept this, but we were also embracing social media in early 2010s as pluralistic and participatory, as something that was enabling conversations. We did drink the Kool-Aid. So I worry that the principles that we are now proposing, are they going to be sufficient to hold us in good stead? That if indeed in our visions for alternate technologies, there is a new thing that we are proposing. How do we ensure that 1 decade down, in a belief that we are working with good principles, we haven't further entrenched the powers we want to check? I think what I'm saying is we want guardrails against self-congratulatory misinterpretations. So a proposal that I offer is that in this iteration, we do a better job of interpreting our principles against the material and institutional realities of our infrastructures. For example, while we speak of the visibility of labor, in places with oppressive regimes, people might not want to be identified for having worked on certain products. And then what does recognition of labor mean? And when we say that there should be local development, does that mean that the servers are locally owned? I think expecting gender rights activists who are fighting battles of physical violence and online violence to then expect that they also maintain their own infrastructure and run a service that protects them from online abuse is untenable. On the flip side, if you just localize the infrastructure, is that sufficient for a project to be called or considered local? I think from just my experience, I look at recent proposals for decentralization or decentralized infrastructures as a solution or a proposed solution for all the ailments that we currently face, with equal part hope, but also caution. Because decentralized infrastructures also have a material reality. The servers live somewhere. The people using it live somewhere, even if it is across dispersed geographies. And that means that these infrastructures will be shaped as per the laws governing that jurisdiction, and they will also be shaped by the interplay of laws across jurisdictions. And there are plenty of laws coming, we know this. So for me, these infrastructures will be shaped by the cost of cloud services in that area. They'll be shaped by the cost of electricity, the taxation laws, the corporate laws. They'll also be shaped by the level of literacy, socioeconomic development factors. And I think foregrounding these realities in evaluation of the principles, as compromised as our principles might get, rather than aiming for an ideal utopia of principles, gives us a much better shot at dispersing the power. Our work needs to be situated and pluralistic, but we do need to delve into what the contradictions these principles surface when they are applied to different contexts. But how do we get to this data or like this information of what these principles and context mean? We're definitely not getting it from profit-driven corporate entities. So one way of getting this data is to play the role of the stranger, the tribe of digital product teams, and a la Latour, right? Like, I think this is something we're somewhat trained in and aware of. And then we see how these principles are interpreted by data product teams, who are this other tribe, and we try and glean insights from that. But that is not my proposal today. It is not my proposal because I think at present there just aren't enough projects that reflect diversity in content, form, or process, to see these adaptations and learn from and inform a comparative analysis. My proposal is what I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. It is to take the risk of being affected by some of the degeneracy of the systems we are pushing against by trying to build our own. It is to take the critical orientation and willfully blur the researcher field distance by committing ourselves to designing these systems with the principles we hold dear. It doesn't have to be forever. It can be an expedition, like just as a metaphor, right? It's something that we do for a while and we return from with diary notes. And these notes will necessarily be messy. They'll contain daily squabbles with teammates. They'll contain details about, some minor sort of corporate law tweak that has bearing on a major product decision. And they will contain frustrations about, for example, how data hosting costs are making it harder to hire people. But it will also contain notes, and I think that's the critical bit, on where we, as flag bearers of these principles, had to compromise from our original positions. And I think then we should document as much as we can, so that this serves as a roadmap for the next set of explorers. I expect there'll be many failures by some definition, but I also expect that there will be many successes by some definition. I think it's important to remember we aren't chasing perfection. We're just chasing greater clarity on how these proposals and ideas hold up against a complex reality over time. What this looks like for each of us will be different. Some of us might be able to do it alongside our existing jobs. Some of us might be able to do it inside our institutions. And some of us, based on our geographies, based on our circumstances, might find that the current institutions are limiting. And I think that's still important. That's an important data point, because it becomes a reason to think of new ones. So am I suggesting that we all pull out our inner civic technologist? Well, yes, that is absolutely my provocation. And I think it'll be generative for scholarship. But I also think it'll be critical for our digital futures. So I'll end with that. Thank you.